Okay, so once again, we are very, very fortunate. First, for living quite nearby to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, truly one of the world's finest collections spanning 5,000 years of human history and creativity. Second, to be able to offer our community museum passes that you can all check out upstairs at the reference desk to gain free admission to the Met. And last but not least, to have art historian Page Knox with us here. Page is an art historian who teaches at Columbia, and she's also an educator at the Met. And we have her here with us periodically as our guide to what's new and worth seeing and why, as she shares with us her passion for the arts as both a teacher and an irrepressible lifelong learner, which is right on target for our library mission. So please help me welcome Page Knox.
And there we are. Perfect.
Here we are.
And that, I think, is at the end, so I'm going to flip. Oh, yep, the beginning. Got it.
Yep,
Okay,
you
fantastic.
got it.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
You're always a thrill to be back here. And I have to say, I woke up this morning and I thought, ooh, it's a gorgeous sunny day. I'm going to see 3 people this afternoon. So when the clouds rolled in a few hours ago, I was sort of a little bit not too upset about it. So I'm thrilled that everybody's here today to have a spotlight on the Met the summer of 2026. And I think I'm doing this correctly. Am I doing this right? Oh yeah, here we go. Sorry, I have a Mac, so I'm not always used to this. Yeah, perfect. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about what's going on at the Met, and what's going on at the Met right now is Raphael. Everybody is obsessed with Raphael. Raphael has been an explosive exhibition at the museum. Every time I go in there, it's absolutely packed, and it's really quite heartwarming to me because I wasn't really sure how well Raphael was going to be received in 2026. So what I'm going to try to do today is give you an overview of the Raphael show and some other exhibitions that are also currently on view at the Met, and also to comment on a few things that are happening there. So I'm going to try to simulate a visit. You're outside of the museum. You see the amazing banner devoted to the Raphael show. You make your way upstairs to the second floor where we have an enormous, again, this is very unusual. The Met doesn't normally give this much attention or real estate to just previewing a show. But then when you enter the exhibition, Raphael Sublime Poetry, you are overwhelmed with 237 objects, most of which are drawings, over 150 drawings. And while the show is the really first major retrospective exhibition devoted to the artist in America, the focus is on drawings. And there's a very particular reason for that. One, in the sense that a lot of these museums in Europe will not part with their Raphaels. They're very dear, they're very important, they're very central to their collections. And but also the drawings kind of allow you to get into the mind of the artist. And so by closely examining these drawings, you can really get a sense of the thought process of how the artist actually kind of arrived at the composition, and also really get a feeling for Raphael. So when you enter the show, you will see this self-portrait. This is Raphael, young age, probably somewhere around the age of 20. And what I love about it is that it absolutely captures his drawing style, which is quite elegant, quite sort of beautiful, but it also captures his personality. And one of the, if you're familiar with Renaissance art history, one of the great early art historians, half gossip, half hearsay, but there is some information there, is a man named Giorgio Vasari, who wrote a book called The Lives of the Artists, where he talked a great deal about artists starting with Giotto, ending with Michelangelo, but spoke a great deal about Raphael. And this is what he said, and I think that the description is so captured in the drawing. He said about Vasari on Raphael, he said, with him liberality with which heaven now and again unites in one person the inexhaustible riches riches of its treasures, and all those graces and rare gifts which are usually shared among many over a long period, is seen in Raphael Sanzio of Urbino, who was as excellent as gracious and endowed with a natural modesty and goodness, sometimes seen in those who possess to an unusual degree a humane and gentle nature, adorned with affability and good fellowship, and he always showed himself sweet and pleasant with persons of every degree and in all circumstances. I would argue run-on sentence, but certainly captures the essence of the drawing style, but also the man. And I think that it's an interesting issue for Raphael, because we tend in 2026 to prefer Leonardo da Vinci. Brilliant mind, questioning the natural world, always so inquisitive and curious. If you read the Walter Isaacson biography, everybody's still quite sort of taken with Leonardo. Michelangelo, people really engage with his struggles, with his sort of anxiety over religious questions and issues of existence, whereas Raphael's just plain beautiful. And for many of us in today's age, that isn't quite as interesting and quite as engaging. So as I said, I was really surprised when this Raphael show came to the Met that it has gotten so much public attention and reception. The show's 9 years in the making, and as I said, the drawings are coming from all over the world. It's an amazing opportunity to see these works of art because they are, in fact, actually rarely on view. You have to make a special appointment to see these kinds of special works. So to have them all there at your disposal is quite fabulous. So when you enter the show, you see the self-portrait of Raphael, and then what the show wants to really underscore was that up until 1850, with the beginning of the avant-garde, if you asked anyone in the world who was the most important painter in the history of art, they would all say Raphael. Because Raphael's drawing was considered to be so perfect, so beautiful, so again, kind of, the ultimate in an exercise of disegno, it was the basis for most academic painting. And so as a result, when one tried to become a talented member of an academy, he tried to draw and emulate Raphael. Raphael also had a larger-than-life reputation when he was actually born in Urbino on Good Friday, April 6th, and he died in Rome also on April 6th in 1520. So that actually, if you're familiar with some religions, there's a kind of a belief that if you die on your birthday, you've completed this cycle, and that there's something very special about you. And of course, the idea that he died on Good Friday was not lost on people. So he had sort of a Christ-like reputation. And when he died, he was so beloved in Rome that he was given a state funeral and buried in the Pantheon. And that was, again, an incredible honor that was rarely given to, never before or after given to an artist. So he really was given pride of place in Rome. And if you go to the Pantheon and you see his tomb, there's a wonderful poetic inscription by a friend of his, a poet named Pietro Bembo, who said, "Here lies that famous Raphael, by whom nature feared to be conquered while he lived, and when he was dying, feared herself to die." And one of the points that the show wants to make by entitling the exhibition Sublime Poetry is that Raphael was a poet. He lived a poetic life. His work had a poetic sensibility, and that's really hit home throughout the show. Now, one of the things that Carmen Baumbach, who's the curator, wanted to focus on was the origins of Raphael. How did this perfect painter emerge fully formed at such a young age? I should mention that he died at the age of 37, so he died very young, but came on the scene quite hot. And she very much attributes that to his birthplace, which is Urbino. If you've ever been to this part of the Italian peninsula, Urbino is situated very prominently on the east coast, kind of a few hours east of Rome, and that was strategic as a place of defense against the Turks. But the man who really creates Urbino, who we know and understand Urbino through, is the Duke of Urbino, who happened to be an important condottieri, but he also developed a warlord, but he also developed this extraordinary Palazzo Ducale, this ducal palace, which was, again, a place where he could sort of reveal his wealth and his accumulations, but also where he could gather around him poets and literary figures and artists and philosophers and humanists to create an exceptional Renaissance city. And this is a shot of the Palazzo Ducale and a painting that's in the show that was believed to have been set in Urbino. The opening gallery tries to mimic the feeling of Urbino, which was very much, again, the brainchild of the famous Duke of Urbino. Everybody kind of knows him, very famous profile. And the Duke, as I said, was a warlord, but he saw himself as a Renaissance man, and in many ways wanted to kind of justify all of the wealth that he had accumulated by, again, creating this extraordinary court. Now, at the court, you can see this is actually an image called the Ideal City, also in the show. There were architects. The idea was to create an environment that engaged with the classical world, with classical architecture, with proportion, with symmetry, with balance. And this is where Raphael grows up. So this is the environment in which he comes of age. Now, also extremely crucial to this is his father, Giovanni Santi, who is a painter and a member of this ducal court. Now, he's not as good as Raphael. However, when Raphael's born, he's born into an artist's studio. Unlike Leonardo, father is a notary, he's illegitimate, there's no encouragement to become an artist, or Michelangelo, whose father literally discouraged him, did not want him to become a sculptor. Raphael is this whole notion that he's kind of born into this world is something that's quite crucial to his upbringing and his early years. You can see Giovanni familiar with religious painting, also with mythological painting, and also a poet himself. He wrote this extraordinary epic poem dedicated to the life and times of the Duke of Urbino, and you can actually see it in the exhibition. There's some amazing loans that Carmen was able to get, this one coming from the Vatican Library. So essentially you understand the origins, and then we turn to the early life in which we see Raphael entering the workshop of Perugino. So we believe around age 11, his father, who knows Perugino, who's one of the top artist living and working in Italy, takes his son and asks Perugino if he can participate as an apprentice in the workshop. And so this is really where Raphael learns the basics, and again, doing quite the basic work of an apprentice, grinding pigments, preparing wood panels, but also engaged in draftsmanship, in disegno, in drawing. Now, the drawing I'm showing you on the left is a drawing by Perugino, but it shows you very much this process that was a part of the workshop. So the drawing, in many ways, stands in for the painting, the Lamentation, which is not in the show, doesn't make it over the ocean, but the drawing shows you not only Perugino as a talented draftsman, and this is what Raphael's learning, but if you see how it's scored, it has like a grid that's placed on top of it. It's a working drawing that will be used to basically transfer to, I don't think I have a pointer, but if you can see this figure here, the man on the lower left, Holy Joseph of Arimathea, it's a drawing that would basically be transferred to the larger panel by an apprentice, and then Perugino would come in and paint. So it's kind of showing you a lot of the things that Raphael is learning in his early time there. Now, Perugino at the time, as I mentioned, was considered to be one of the top artists in his field in Italy, if not the top artist. And he was very well known for making these rather placid images of the Virgin and Child, or with John the Baptist. And this is fairly classic Perugino, rather stiff, two figures on either side, fairly symmetrical, but not terribly engaging, not terribly psychological. And you can always tell Perugino because the women all look like they're sort of sucking on lemons. They have this kind of taunt expression. And one of the things you need to know about Raphael was that he was a very quick study. He used to go in, sort of assess the situation, take what he could from people he worked with, and basically make that part of his own style, and in many ways improve upon those people who had inspired him. And so by the time that Perugino is at the end of his career, he's kind of more well known as the teacher of Raphael, which I don't think sat terribly well with him. However, you see when you go into the show images of Perugino, also an image in the corner of Pinturicchio, another artist that Raphael also worked with, and then the first Raphael painting in the show, which is this altarpiece which had been for many years in a small church in Città di Castello. It's believed to be the first painting where Raphael signs the contract as master, so he is now off on his own. And you can see when you look at the painting some elements of Perugino, the angels up top, that he's brought into the work. Many people also say, ooh, this work really needs to be restored. It was, in fact, restored for the show, but speaks to the new methods of restoration. In today's world, you don't repaint. You basically restore what is available to you, and then you basically leave what has deteriorated in sort of an open state. So this different, every generation has its approach to restoration, but this piece, having been in this church for so many hundreds of years, had suffered, but it's wonderful, wonderful work to have in the show. Now, the show also does some monumental things. One is reuniting the Colonna altarpiece. If you're familiar with the Met's collection, the Colonna altarpiece, which I'm showing you sort of the top portion, was given to the Met by J.P. Morgan in the early part of the 20th century. It's the only Raphael altarpiece in the United States. It was a very major gift and a very substantial part of the Met's collection. And so what you'll often find, so the painting was made for a convent in the early part of the 16th century, and that also explains why the Virgin's gown looks kind of black, because they didn't have the money for very expensive, high-quality lapis. And also those cute little kids' outfits on the Christ child and John the Baptist, the nuns did not want nudity. So it's the only time you're ever going to see Christ in a jumper, but there it is. And it's a wonderful picture that shows you kind of this transitional moment when Raphael is still engaging with the Perugino style, which you see in the angels up on top, and also the female saints in the back. But he will also, and we're going to talk about this, goes to Florence and sees the work of Leonardo and Michelangelo, and it very much informs Peter and Paul on either side. So it's a crucial moment in his career, but what Carmen has done is to reunite the predella. Now, the predella, usually when you see altarpieces in churches, if they're still intact, there's normally a predella on the lower portion, which tells a narrative, usually about the subject in some way. In this case, it's the final, moments, the Passion of Christ. But when the convent sold the picture, and this was very common back in the day, instead of just selling the entire piece, they cut up the predella and sold off the smaller panels. So they got spread all over the world. 2 in the Dulwich Gallery, which is the saints on either side. The Met has the Agony in the Garden. National Gallery has the image of the crucifixion, the carrying the cross, and then the Lamentation is Gardner. So Carmen has brought them back together, first time in 350 years. So it's really great to see it all in one piece back as it was originally in the when it was in the convent. And it's also very interesting to sort of see this issue of restoration, because some of the pieces look very new and some of the pieces look a little bit older. So you kind of get a sense of each institution's philosophy about restoration. Now this, Oh, yes. No one would, no, it's a definition of a loan. Everything goes back. No, we don't keep anything. I think we would be very unpopular if we did that.
Folks, if we could hold our questions to the end and
that's
let Paige get through, we promise we'll have Q&A.
It's a good question, though. But no, they all come and then they all go back. So the Met, as we were saying, though, these loans are very important, but a lot of institutions won't lend major paintings. So, for example, the Vatican did not want to part with the Odie altarpiece, but they did what we were able to get the drawing of one particular apostle from the British Museum, and you can see the head of the apostle looking up to the Virgin as she assumes into heaven. So again, as I'm saying, like, it's the drawing that sort of stands in for the painting, but you can see Raphael kind of working out questions of composition. Now, thinking of that idea of working out questions, the Vatican did lend the predella of that altarpiece, and you can see, again, stories of the life of the Virgin, the Annunciation, the visit of the Magi, and then the circumcision. And literally right next to the painting, you have the drawing. And the drawing, which comes to us from Stockholm, of the Annunciation, shows you Raphael figuring it out, right? So when a painting is actually finally created, an altarpiece, there is no kind of creative license. You have a patron who signs off on everything. And what do they sign off on? They sign off on the drawings. But I love this drawing of the Annunciation because, to me, you almost see the Palazzo Ducale of Urbino as the backdrop. So you see that engagement with perspective and with balance and with symmetry that has become such an essential part of Raphael's style. Now, again, there are wonderful objects in the show, processional crosses, altarpieces. This is an altarpiece that was put back together. Again, Carmen reuniting pieces. We don't have the central painting that stayed in Berlin, but she was able to bring together the image of Mary Magdalene and the image of St. Catherine, and you can see either side as this was sort of a private devotional piece. So it gives you a sense that Raphael was doing more than just making paintings. I love this picture because this really sums up Raphael, particularly in his early years. It's Saint Sebastian, an early martyr who basically, if you're familiar with images of him, he died tied to a column with body filled with arrows. It's always bloody and just the pain and the agony. Not with Raphael. Raphael picks a very good-looking young adolescent guy, and he holds an arrow. That's about the extent of the anguish, right? Which is, again, why people have not always been drawn to Raphael, because he seems to make everything beautiful. Now, so as I said, the next gallery focuses on this moment when he goes to Florence. As I mentioned, he was working with a man named Pinturicchio in Siena, and he hears about this amazing competition that's taking place in the city. Now, this city at this particular moment, during the Quattrocento, the 1400s, the Medici basically controlled the city. And with the death of Lorenzo il Magnifico, ultimately the Medici are pushed out. In comes Savonarola, this very evangelical preacher, bonfire of vanities. After a couple of years, the Florentines kind of tire of this. They get rid of Savonarola, and they create this new republic. And the republic wants to decorate its council chamber, Palazzo Vecchio. So what do? They decide to commission the two most important artists from Florence at that moment, Michelangelo and Leonardo, to both come into the room and to create murals that speak to important battles of the city. Now, this is an interesting experiment because the two men loathe each other. This isn't even a frenemy situation. They cannot truly stand to be in the same space with each other. But as you know, you put two rivals in the same room and you tend to kind of get the best of both. So if you've been to the Palazzo Vecchio, if you've been to Florence, you're probably saying, well, I don't think I have ever seen this. And you would be right, because the project was never completed. Michelangelo got as far as a large drawing. This is a copy of that drawing. And he was called to Rome by the Pope to create his tomb. Leonardo starts working on the wall, not really going terribly well, and in classic Leonardo fashion, he kind of tires of the project and leaves Florence with the wall unfinished. Not terribly popular decision. But in either case, they were never completed. However, when Raphael goes to Florence, they're both working, and it's a very exciting time to see these two very important contemporary artists at work. Now, Michelangelo, not very friendly, kind of suspicious, doesn't work well with others, kind of keeps to himself. Leonardo, very gracious, welcomes in Raphael, and Raphael basically starts to have these intimate conversations with him about the nature of painting. This is a Leonardo drawing that's in the show, and you can actually see Leonardo very much engaged with human anatomy, but also the Battle of Anghiari, the drawing sort of combined in two. But what's important for our purposes is that Raphael starts to copy Leonardo. And this is a copy of a painting that was made by Leonardo that he took to France with him, and it's about a moment in the Metamorphosis tales when Zeus turns himself into a swan to basically abduct the beautiful Leda, and they end up having these children. It was seen to be erotic by the French queen, and it was destroyed. But we know that when Leonardo welcomes Raphael into his studio, this painting is on view, and Raphael makes a lot of copies. And this is where you start to see the impact of the Leonardo style. Leonardo says to him that Perugino's style is very controlled, it's very tight, it doesn't allow for a psychological engagement. And, drawing should really convey what's on the mind of the sitter. And also lots of ideas of turning and twisting, more dynamic styles, more engagement with a technique that Leonardo perfected called sfumato, which means smoky, less rigid outlines. And you can really see how Raphael starts to adopt this new modern style. Now, Raphael's not getting the big commissions in Florence that Michelangelo and Leonardo did, but he becomes friendly with a number of merchants, and everyone wants a Madonna and Child. And this becomes Raphael's bread and butter while he's in Florence. And again, we don't have one of these large Virgin and Childs from the Florentine period that are so famous. Kunsthistorisches Uffizi, the Louvre, they all will not part with them, but we have the drawings. And what's wonderful is you can really see the impact of Leonardo. Leonardo was interested in spirals, in pyramids, in dynamic compositions, and this is when you start to see Raphael doing this. Now, we don't have the paintings, but we have this large, finished drawing. We call it a cartoon, not because it's Mickey Mouse, but because it's a working drawing. And it's the same size as the painting that's in the Louvre. And you can see this was the image that was transferred. This was the final study. So it's wonderful, again, to sort of see the hand of the artist. Now, one of the things that the show brings out, and I always love it when I feel like I learned something new, and I had never thought about this from this perspective, is why is this Virgin and Child theme so popular? Why is the Madonna and Child so ever present in the 14 and 1500s in Italy? And one can make a lot of different ideas about that because the image goes back historically to icons from the very, very earliest days. However, what Carmen suggests is the very, very high rate of infant mortality. And if you do look at records, the odds are 50-50 as a woman. If you give birth, you're going to survive it. And the odds were even lower for children, 1 out of every 3. So there was a lot of death. People lost wives, people lost daughters, people lost sisters, people lost mothers. And it was a very, very a time where this was commonplace, but that the grief of all of this is something that she wanted to really focus on. And she brings in this amazing loan from the Bargello. It's by Verrocchio, who is an important sculptor from the sort of mid-1400s, teacher of Leonardo and of Perugino. in his studio, and it shows you a tomb carving that was commissioned by a man named Giovanni Tornabuoni for his wife's tomb. His wife died in childbirth, and you can actually see very graphically the image of his wife, literally dying, and the stillborn child who's then brought to Giovanni, and the anguish and the grief of the figures that surround her. And we also know that Raphael himself, his mother died in childbirth, giving birth to his sister. So this was something very personal to him as well. And Carmen has gotten this amazing loan. In Urbino, there were not a lot of records about, the Tuscans are very good record keepers, but she went and found records of candle sales, which seemed to validate the date. There was a large sale to the Santi family, the date of Raphael's mother's death. Also in that gallery, you can see a gynecological book, which basically makes you realize that if the birth didn't kill you, the doctors were going to. A little bit scary, but that there was so little understanding of the female anatomy. And this is an interesting time because Leonardo is doing dissections of pregnant women, and it was seen to be very sacrilegious and very controversial, but in many ways important. Now, if you've been to the show, you'll know this sort of a long hallway, and there are 3 or 4 very marvelous rooms in this long stretch, one being a room devoted to the Madonna and Child. Some of the most beautiful images in the exhibition showing you how Raphael makes this intimate, makes the child sort of, again, looking back to the earlier Peruginos, so much more dynamic, so much more emotional. And you can actually see a wonderful piece inspired by a Leonardo. And if you go around sort of the outer portion of the gallery, you can see a wonderful infrared that looks at the painting and takes away the outer layers of paint and looks at the underlying drawings. And I'm very, very grateful to Carmen because the way she did the show, all the technology is sort of pushed to the outside, so you really focus on the images, but there's a lot of interesting information. This is a marvelous example of what's a very rare example of what we call non finito, an unfinished Madonna by Raphael. Why is it unfinished? As I mentioned, Leonardo left a lot of things unfinished. He often just wasn't that, he was more interested in the idea. Once it came to executing, he kind of got tired of it. But Raphael was a businessman, and you don't get the check until you finish the job. That said, the date, 1508, he's working on this Esterhazy Madonna. He's painted in the background, painted in the Virgin. Again, it shows you process. But why are the children unfinished? Because the Pope calls them to Rome. And when the Pope calls you to Rome, you go. Because if you don't go to Rome, you're going to go to hell. So you better go to Rome, right? So leave it unfinished. And he makes his way down to Rome, really through another individual from Urbino, Bramante, who tells the Pope about this brilliant young painter in Florence. And he's asked to paint the stanza, the rooms for the Pope, which we'll get to in a moment. And this shows you now Raphael in Rome. And you can see, yet again, with each phase, he changes slightly in his composition, in his confidence, in the sort of style that he chooses. And you're going to see that the virgins now start to have darker hair. And we're going to get to why that is in a moment. But you can see it's a much more complex pose. And what I truly love that's in the show is right in front of this gorgeous album, Madonna, is the drawing. On one side, you can see him working out the pose. And you kind of think, what young woman could sit there and hold this? I call it the pretzel pose. If anybody does Pilates or bar method, it's a very hard pose to hold. And we now know that he actually used male assistants in his studio. So he doesn't have a woman in the studio holding this challenging position. So figures out the pose. Then on the flip side of the drawing, he figures out where he's going to put the children, and then you go to the painting. So this, again, shows you process. Now, the next gallery is the killer. And I would say if you have limited time, go to this gallery because there are exceptional loans that you will never see in one room again. Portraiture. Now, this is a portrait that Raphael would do in 1503, but who is the kind of unsung hero in this gallery is the Mona Lisa. So Raphael has seen her when he's been in Leonardo's studio. And why is the Mona Lisa, why are all those people lined up in the Louvre and taking all these pictures? Why are they there? Most people say, my students say, because my mom told me I had to go, but there is a very legitimate reason as to why this is such an important and iconic work. In the past, portraits of women in the Renaissance were sites of display, always in profile, showing off the hairstyles, the jewelry, the clothing, the lands in the background. What does Leonardo do? Paints a young woman, Lisa Gioconda. She's the wife of a silk merchant. She's not the Duchess of Urbino. What does he do with her? He gets rid of the fancy clothes. He gets rid of the hairstyles. He gets rid of the jewelry. And most importantly, he turns her to look at you. And for the first time, you look back at her and you wonder, is she smiling? So you start to think about the person as an individual, psychologically, and this becomes very, very important development in portraiture. Now, Raphael knows this, and so he will incorporate this in this portrait of the daughter of the Duke of Urbino. She's a very important figure in terms of the transition from the de Montefeltro family to the della Rovere family. But what you see is a society portrait, got to show the clothing, got to show the jewelry. And what he's also showing you, which is really interesting, is that the Duke had a very large collection of Flemish painting. This was becoming all the rage. The Flemish artists were very attractive to these Renaissance collectors, and Raphael has seen this. So he's kind of bringing together in classic Raphael fashion all of these different influences to create a very modern portrait. Now, another portrait from this early period is one of the great loans from the Galleria, the Borghese Gallery. This is the lady with a unicorn. It's believed to be Laura Orsini. Now, Laura Orsini was also in the marriage market to a della Rovere at this point. Was not certain if the portrait was made just before or just after, but it certainly is a society portrait with the jewelry, with the clothing. There's an interesting twist on this, though, because Laura Orsini, her lineage was a little bit disputed. Her mother, Giulia Orsini, who was a Farnese, was one of the most beautiful women in Rome and just happened to also be the mistress of Rodrigo Borgia, the Pope. Some have actually believed that Laura Orsini is the daughter of the Pope, illegitimate. We don't know any of this, but why does Raphael put in that unicorn? Well, for one, the unicorn is a symbol of the Farnese family, but it also suggests purity. It suggests innocence. And so if there was some question about where she came from, Raphael's trying to sort of soften that in a very interesting way. But you can see, absolutely takes it from the Mona Lisa. Now, there's some wonderful, and this is shows you that the unicorn was at one point a dog. This picture was also painted over with a saint, St. Catherine. So the painting's been through a few iterations, but a wonderful loan. Arguably the best portrait in the show is Castiglione. Castiglione comes from the Louvre. I couldn't believe they lent it. Castiglione is from Urbino, grows up at the court of the Duke of Urbino, very polished, very debonair, and a good friend of Raphael's. Now, he writes a critical book called The Courtier, and this book is all about how to behave at court. And the whole idea is that you need to be entertaining, but you do not take center stage. You need to be a good conversationalist, but you do not dominate. You need to be beautifully dressed, but do not overdress. Do not overshadow the Duke, who's ever at the center of the court. And Castiglione gives a term to this. He calls it sprezzatura, which means nonchalance, understated elegance, a sense of, again, things being very casual. Oh, I just threw on this outfit, where I call it Greenwich casual. It's the same idea. You all know about this, right? Oh, I just threw this on. But if you know what to look for, he's got all the right things. But this notion of sprezzatura was something at the core of Raphael's personality. And this was one of the reasons he was so successful. He knew how to get along in the papal court. He was very personable. He was very sociable. And he really attracted people to him, but he understood how to let them shine. And so these two have a very important friendship. And this painting kind of captures that concept. This is not sprezzatura, right? This is a power portrait. I always say today the opposite of sprezzatura is Instagram. Anyway, if you know what I mean. So this is actually a portrait of the Fornarina. The Fornarina, the baker's daughter, was Raphael's lover. And again, Vasari writes about her extensively and actually blames Raphael's death on her. She was the great love of his life, and he was working on the murals in the Farnese Palazzo. The owners wanted him to finish the job, so they decided to put the Fornarina up in the house and that they could just stay there and never had to leave, and he could work more efficiently. And apparently they had a night of passionate romance, so passionate that Raphael died the next day with a smile on his face. That's the story. Now that is complete mythology. Really was the Pope, the new Pope, Leo X, worked him to death. But you see this beautiful Fornarina, you see her now as the Madonna, you see her as Venus, you see her, she's very versatile, but she appears over and over again in the Roman moment. And you can see that this is painted by Raphael and Giulio Romano because it's on his easel when he dies. So Giulio Romano, his assistant, finishes the painting. It's got this, if you see it in the show, there's this wonderful blue band around her arm that says Raphael Urbino. Is it a signature? Possibly, but it's also a poetic Petrarchian reference to linkage. So it may be, again, this poetic side of Raphael. And there's a wonderful little ring, if you got to look for this, if you go to the show. It's right, you see that? It's very hard to see. But it's not all the way down. It's sort of higher up on her finger. And people actually believe that there was a secret marriage between Raphael and the Fornarina. We will never know, but she appears in many of his images. Bindo Altoviti, the best-looking guy in Rome. Fabulous. Apollo, really kind of captures this idea of the gorgeous young adolescent male. And this is an age group that Raphael hung out with and that he also really admired, this time period where you're no longer a child, you're not fully formed as an adult, and you can just see that Bindo Altoviti has this extraordinary sense of his great mojo. These are the people that Raphael is spending time with. Now, there's a room devoted to the drawings of the stanza that Raphael was called down to prepare. What Carmen has done is off to the side, has recreated the rooms virtually for you. These are the stanza, the four stanza. You can see the very famous stanza della Segnatura. These are the actual rooms if you go to the Vatican. And you can see each one there with equivalent drawings. This is a situation where I would argue you kind of have to know these rooms to know the drawings, but they're marvelous demonstrations incorporating very specific figures, very specific elements of the images. And you can see the cartoon that Raphael creates of the image of God. So something really, again, spectacular to see these drawings. You can see the image of Apollo. You can see the blind poets of Homer and also Dante and Virgil. And then, of course, the stanza di Eleudorio with the wonderful horse that comes running in. And then another image of this fabulous angel. So all these drawings are on the wall for you to spend a lot of time looking at. Also, the prints and drawings, the collaboration between Raphael and Marcantonio Raimondi. Marcantonio Raimondi is a printer, and Raphael decides to take advantage of this new technology And Raphael will give his drawings to Raimondi, who will turn them into prints. He will distribute these prints throughout Europe, and this is how the style of Raphael becomes so recognized. And you can then see the trickle down of the images on things like Majolica plates. So it's really quite wonderful in that sense. Great loans, marvelous Madonnas and Childs, some new attributions. Carmen actually kind of discovers this Puto by Raphael, and it's in the show for you to see. Some more marvelous altarpieces, but the real kicker is the final room with the tapestries. These are tapestries that were ordered for the Vatican, for the Sistine Chapel, by Leo X, a Medici Pope, who basically wants to prevent everybody who walks in from looking up at what Michelangelo has done on the ceiling to looking at the walls. His father, if you've been to the Sistine, this is, by the way, the reason why Leo X loved Raphael so much, because this is what Giulio Romano did for his portrait of Leo, and you can see how Leo might prefer the softer. Raphael makes everybody look really good. It was one of his I think, as I said, everybody looks beautiful in the world of Raphael. But he made these tapestries to go below the series that was actually commissioned by his father, Lorenzo de' Medici, when he has the great painters of the Quattrocento from Florence come down to Rome to paint the walls, the life of Christ and the life of Moses. So these very expensive tapestries are woven in Belgium, and the cartoons, you can see this was the moment, very unfortunately, Raphael died in 1520. So the 500th anniversary of his death, 2020 was a bit of a bust in terms of the celebration. They rehung the tapestries in the Sistine, but no one was there to see it. But you can see the cartoons that Raphael created for the weavers who made the tapestries. The cartoons are all in the V&A. They were acquired by Charles I, but you can see drawings that relate to these cartoons. These are the lives of Peter and Paul. This is one of the most amazing, the miracle of the fishes. And you can see the cartoon. This is not in the show, but you can see drawings that relate to it. The actual tapestries that we have in the show come from Spain. They're from the collection of Philip II. Every major monarch in Europe wanted a version of these, so they were multiple sets that were made. And only one small piece of the original Vatican tapestry is in the exhibition, but we have 3 wonderful works from the Spanish collection. And you can see there's the miracle of the fishes and Christ handing the keys to Peter. So the final gallery shows you at the last sort of years of Raphael's life, so overworked by this Pope. The Pope puts him on all of these projects, creating images of ancient Rome. He becomes the new architect of St. Peter's. He's expected to do this Farnese Palazzo, and so many others that he basically works him to death. But the final image in the room shows you a fragment from that original tapestry made for Leo, the rest of which are in the Vatican. And it shows you Paul, there's a moment when Paul is imprisoned, and God, to release Paul, sends an earthquake. And this earthquake basically then the ground opens up, and the prison, allows Paul to escape. But here you actually see the drawing that Raphael did of the earthquake. And I would argue that when you look at this drawing, it doesn't look like Raphael. It doesn't look like anything else you've seen in the show. All those beautiful, perfect, idealized forms. Now we're getting something a little closer to what's to come with the work of Michelangelo and the Mannerists. And so it kind of gives you a little window into what might have been had Raphael lived, because he dies at 37. As I said, Michelangelo lives to be 90. Leonardo, almost into his 70s. And Raphael's life is cut short. So the show is an incredible amalgamation of the work, but also really does make you ponder how would art history have been different? How would the images that we know and love have changed if Raphael had survived? So go see the show. It's quite a fabulous exhibition. Now, just very briefly, what else is up if you go? Costume art. This is a new exhibition that just opened at the Met, first Monday of May, and it is a landmark moment because you may know, if you've been, the beloved gift shop is no more and has been transformed into space dedicated to the Costume Institute. So these spaces, very, very important now because the department is arguably that draws the biggest crowds to the museum. So we have the Conde Nast galleries now located where the gift shop used to be. This is the old, now no more. It's the entrance to the exhibition. So the exhibition is called Costume Art, and what it really tries to do is to think about the idea that for many, many years, and this is, of course, when the Costume Institute opens in the Met in 1945, it's in the basement. And that's not just, that's not an accident. It's very symbolic of how the museum viewed fashion. It wasn't considered art. It wasn't on par with the rest of the museum. It was sort of that little engine that could down there, kind of pushed away to the side. But as I said, of the major 10 shows in the last, 20 years, the top draws have always been costume. So there's a recognition now that not just is this an important department, but that fashion is art. And so what Andrew tried to do in this exhibition was to think about what was the connection between fashion and all the other departments in the museum, and it's the human body and the connection of clothing to the body. And so what you'll see in the show are fashion pieces compared with works of art. But what's important to note, in the old days, the work of art would have been on top, symbolically, as well as, in reality, to suggest the importance. Now, the fashions are on top. And the idea is, how does looking at fashion inform the way we look at works of art? In the old days, you'd have shows, we had a show on Cubism, and how Cubism impacted fashion. So how did the works of art change the styles? But now the mindset is different. How can we, knowing about fashion, understand works of art more thoroughly? So the show starts out with the basic idea about when does clothing begin. It begins during the fall. Adam and Eve, when they realize they have sinned, they are naked, and there's a long discussion of the naked and the nude, and a lot of images that look back to. In fact, there's a Raphael print from Raimondi. So the whole idea is, not only are you going to kind of connect art and fashion in some interesting new ways, but maybe you'll inspire people who are more interested in fashion to go look at the Raphael show. So it's meant to have a lot of different synergies. It speaks to different body types, the idealized Greek body, abstract bodies created through various types of apparatuses, bustles, different kinds of corsets, and the historical sort of elements of that. And then it kind of looks forward into this reclamation of the body with various designers like Rei Kayakubo, and then comparing, again, Rei Kayakubo to Henry Moore or to Jean Arp or to different styles. It's very provocative. It encourages you to kind of think outside of the box on a lot of things. It thinks about bodies that have disabilities in terms of sensory disabilities, or various, comparing sort of the blind man of Picasso with clothing that's made for the blind. And then we move into another section. By the way, my sons think this is very hilarious that I'm now lecturing on body tattoos and telling you how fabulous they are. But it is, again, using the body as a means of adornment. And so the first part of the show thinks about different kinds of bodies, and then the second part of the show thinks about what do all bodies have in common. They all have skin, they all have arteries and veins, they all have various elements in common. So that second part of the show kind of thinks about fashion, engaging with these common elements of the body. And then finally, if you go all the way to the back of this new gallery, they actually found some of the original space from the building when it was constructed in 1900, this section. So it kind of opens up with an interesting display of Issey Miyake, and then a comment on going back to the nude and how do we determine what is nude, the color nude. It can be determined in many various ways. So it's very thought-provocative, very, very, very provocative. Also, and I think I mentioned this last time, we have our Tang wing, which is shut down, modern, and contemporary. It's all closed. If you go to the Met, you're probably going to hear a lot of hammering and nailing because they're really demolishing that section. And some of the selected works have gone to the Lehman wing, where a show on modern portraiture is taking place, where you're going to see some old favorites, people you may recognize, Gertrude Stein, Leonora Carrington, some recent acquisitions, particularly that related to shows like our Harlem Renaissance show, and then recent contemporary artists, people like Njideka Ankanyili Crosby. Also in the Lehman Central Portico area, we have the pieces that were part of the facade commissions. So the Wangechi Mutu piece, the E. Bull piece, and these were all on the front of the Met. I think I talked about this last time, and often the Met chose to acquire the objects, and so they're now basically being put on view and sort of giving pride of place in this atrium. And then finally, what is going on at the Met? Woohoo! This was, and I have to say, they kept this very quiet because I was in Copenhagen and heard about this, and everyone said, Paige, did you know about this? And I said, absolutely not. I did not know about this. But if you don't know, the announcement was made about 2 weeks ago that Ronald Lauder is giving the Neue Gallery to the Met, which is tremendous. It's incredible. If you're familiar with the Neue Gallery, Ronald Lauder was the ambassador to Austria. He got very involved in the repatriation of some of the Klimt paintings, including very famously the Adele Bloch-Bauer piece. He was always very taken with Austrian works of art, and he created this gallery, which is on is it 86 or 85th? I think it's 85th. 86? Anyway, I should know, but this is the building. It's stunning. And it really was, I always thought, this incredible gem. And you went there, and there were Schiele works, there were Klimt works, a lot of the German artists, a lot of Neue Sachlichkeit movement. The Met really didn't have a lot of this. And the Met, it's interesting also because our new director is Max Hollein, who is Austrian. And he had been involved with the Neue from the get-go prior to his arrival at the Met. So he and Ronald Lauder had had a very long-term relationship, and I believe Lauder realized, and there's a lot of different rumors and hearsay, but I think Lauder just said, I'm not going to be around, forever, and I want the future of this museum to be insured, so I'm going to give it to the museum along with donations of some of his private collection paintings that are part of the collection to the Met, but it's going to be kept as a satellite, kind of similar to the cloisters. So Adele Bloch-Bauer is not going to be moving across the street. She's going to stay in pride of place. But it is an incredible addition to the museum. And I think it's really a testament to Max Hollein and to, again, his vision, and to be able to have, this space as, an additional part of the museum, to me, is extraordinary. And of course, we get to have these incredible Klimt paintings, part of the Met's collection. It's an amazing gift. Very few people give this generously in today's world. So quite a testament, again, to the Met and the power of the institution. So come to the museum. Lots going on, many wonderful exhibitions that are open, and so many changes taking place. It's a very, very exciting time. So I'm happy now to answer any questions that you might have. I've thrown a lot at you in 1 hour, but I'm more than happy if you have any questions, comments.
We have to applaud you first,
Oh!
because you are amazing. You are truly, truly amazing. And if you want to raise your hand, please let me come to you. We're recording this, so we'd love to capture all your questions.
On your last comment there about the gallery that's going to be part of the Met Museum, when is the timing on that? And is it coming with endowment money?
Is it coming what?
With endowment money.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I believe 2028 is the plan. As I understand it, Ronald and his daughter Erin have created a foundation that's basically going to ensure that so one of the reasons that, as I understand it, and again, I wasn't privy to this, so I'm just telling you what I've read in the New York Times, that they really did not, they don't want the Met to basically come in, take everything off the walls and put it, at 82nd and 5th. It's going to stay the same. They've created an endowment for all of the paintings. They've given, I think there were 20 works that he owned with his daughters, and that has been given as a gift to the Met. The only thing I think that's a little up in the air is what happens to the current director. And that I don't know the details of that. But yes, there's a fund. I think really what happened was that he started to kind of look to the future, and his brother had just passed away, and all of his works came to the Met. And as I said, there's a long-standing relationship with Max Hollein, and Ronald also is very involved in our Arms and Armor department. So he knows the museum very well, and it just seemed like a logical way to ensure the future of this very marvelous, marvelous collection. And also the Met really doesn't have a lot of this. We have very few works by a lot of the Austrians. So it's incredible for our holdings.
Paige, going back to Raphael, there was one painting that you said went to France that the Queen found very
yes.
erotic, and it was destroyed. So how do we know what the painting looks like?
Painting by Leonardo.
Oh, okay,
yes,
Leonardo.
because he had assistants who copied it.
Oh, okay.
So there were So the piece that you see in the show, that's not it. I'm going to be too
No,
far
I
to
know.
go
You
back.
don't have to go back to it. I
That
wondered.
is a copy that's made by one of Leonardo's assistants.
Okay.
And as I said, it was a very famous painting, and we know Raphael saw it in Leonardo's studio and made drawings after it, which then impact the paint. As I said, Raphael's really impressive in the fact that he could just kind of pick up on what he thought was something that was important about another artist's style, kind of take it and make it his own. And he did that throughout his entire life.
Okay, we have a question here. Hold on.
Hi, I think it's very interesting that Raphael's whole oeuvre, if you will, changed by the influences of Leonardo. Before Leonardo, I found his faces very bland, very
right.
boring. But once he turned his subjects to have us and the subject sort of contact each
Right.
other, everything changed. His
Yeah,
paintings
psychological.
were much more interesting and much more engaging.
Couldn't agree with you more. And I think, as I mentioned, the joy was that Leonardo recognized in Raphael a young talent, and he was willing to spend time with him and have conversations with him and open up his studio to him. So in many ways, Leonardo has an enormous impact on Raphael, which is why when Raphael paints the Stanza della Signatura, he makes Leonardo, the face of Plato, is Leonardo da Vinci.
You're
So
like
that's the nod.
Vasari. You're like our own Vasari, Giorgio Vasari. Okay, one more. I know we've gone a little bit over. Does anybody have one final quick question?
I will just say one thing.
Okay.
The Raphael show is very crowded. It's closing in 4 weeks. Go, but just be prepared because there are a lot of people in there, and it is hard to kind of get
Navigate,
close to a lot
yeah.
of things.
Okay,
Yeah.
one more.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. Could you give us a bit of your background, what led you to the career you had?
Oh, God. My students are always like, tell me about your career path. I was like, well, it's actually kind of more of a zigzag. It's a long story, but I just always do tell all my students that want to get into the art world that, so I have a son who's in finance, and that's kind of a very straightforward path. And I have a lot of my students are in medicine, or they want to become lawyers. That's very straightforward. I just was extraordinarily fortunate to have a lot of mentors in my life. So I was an art history major at Yale, but I was also an econ major because, I had to hedge the bet, right? Worked in the financial world for 10 years, and then when we moved out here, one of my mentors at the Yale Center for British Art needed someone. So I went to work for her, and she told me, because I had 2 young children at the time, little people, little problems, get your PhD now, because it's just going to get more complicated. So I was very fortunate to go to Columbia, get my PhD, and then able to get a part-time job at the Met. I got actually a full-time job at the Met in 2009, and then I got laid off. So it was kind of, but it was not a great time. Essentially then I was brought back part-time, but it still allowed me to teach at Columbia. So then when I was working, I was starting out in the American wing, but then I went to work for education. Then membership picked me up to teach classes at the Met. So I teach Mondays at the Met, which is a wonderful class for patrons. And then development asked me to do travel with the Met. So I have I wear a tremendous number of hats, and like I said, there's no career path. My job description is complicated, but as I always say to all of my students that want to get into this field, spread the net wide, don't ever say no, and be open to some opportunities that might lead you to things that you wouldn't expect them to. So
We're
how's
so
that for
grateful
it?
you said yes to us. Thank you so much. Thank you,
very
Paige.
much.
You're wonderful.
And really, thank you all. This is a fantastic series, and I've had a lot of fun.
And we're going to
doing
do it
these.
again. We're going to
Sounds
do
like
it
a
again
plan.
next season. Thank you.
Thanks
Spotlight
again.
on the Met. Thanks you all for coming.